Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be upon you. I hope you have been well. Welcome back to Becoming Muslim, one of the many support tools we offer converts via ontoislam.com. If you have a question or are curious about any convert related matters, we likely have a podcast, an article, or live person that can help illuminate the path back to God and your true nature, Islam. Today, we are so blessed to have Grace Song back as our guest speaker. She has been on the show twice before to tell about her convert story and struggles along the way. She is a convert of 28 years and the executive director of the Usuli Institute, a research and education-based think tank whose aim is to reclaim and reaffirm the beauty and wisdom of the Quran in Islam. Grace, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
It is our pleasure. So one of my favorite quotes from the Usuli Institute website is, "The Quran does lead to a straight path, but it is not narrow." As converts, we sometimes start on this path to Islam, and it seems as if we are walking a tightrope. But the more we read, as is our first command, the wider that path becomes. This is a common theme and thread in convert stories. In your own conversion story, there were points where you said you were confused or conflicted by some of the information you got from Muslims about how to be a quote-unquote good Muslim. Briefly, would you care to share a few examples on how this contributed to the founding of the Usuli Institute?
Sure. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. When I came to Islam, I came through books, and so I was really just blown away with the ideas and the beauty of the message, and honestly, like how intuitive the message was. I think that was the most shocking thing for me, was to read about the tenets of the faith and the humanity. It's just everything that you understand about being a good person and what you should do and being kind and those kinds of things. And I think that what was shocking to me was when I entered sort of the mosque for the first time after I converted, and I was confused because, I had a lot of questions. Obviously, I think as a convert, you just genuinely have a lot of questions, and everything sort of comes through the filter of your intellect and understanding, like, okay, why? Does this make sense? Why do we do this? Why do we not do that? And I found that, unfortunately, for a lot of different reasons, now that I understand 28 years in, the mosque is not a wonderful place for asking a lot of these kinds of questions. And there are a lot of, underlying assumptions about, how, for example, women should act or converts should be, or, like, there are just a lot of ritualistic things that people do, and they don't get very excited about answering, questions about things. And so that confused me. And, so I think that it took a while, when you convert, everything is new, and you're just kind of trying to get your bearings. And so there was just a lot of stuff that didn't match up to what I had come to through books. And so I kind of struggled for a bit, for a year, coming in and out, at trying to just make, sense of things. And then I met my husband, and who is a scholar, and this is sort of like the start of our journey with the eventual founding of the Usuli Institute. But the point that I think was really important to take away is just the importance of knowledge and expanding your understanding through not people but books and reflection and developing your relationship with God. Knowledge is really, when you understand in the Islamic tradition just the high value of knowledge, you really understand why, because your road does really widen. Whatever intellectual shackles you may have or baggage, all of that stuff gets undone with when you replace it with good knowledge. And and that takes work, takes investment, and time. And honestly, for today, for people who are thinking of converting, you got to this point because you took the time to read, you took the time, to question, and that has to continue, through your entire journey. So the Usuli Institute, came like gosh, 20 years, 25 years after, about 20 years, after my conversion, after, I mean, my husband is a scholar of Islam, and so we've, been doing this work in terms of like, publication, research, education for many, many years. It's what we've always done. And we decided to create a nonprofit institute to try and elevate that and elevate the work that we do, and also, bring more people into the work that we're doing. But the whole focus has really been to elevate reason, thinking, critical thinking, beauty, all of the things that make, I think, Islam humanistic and elevating and enlightening for human beings. And I think, and also to really fight the negative tide of Islamophobia these days. And maybe we can get into a separate conversation about that. But, truly, I think as a convert, as a human being, I mean, even not just a convert, your protection in the world is always to develop your knowledge, to use that intellect that God gave you, to read, to challenge yourself, to challenge the world, and question, how do we make the world a better place? How do we make it more moral, more ethical? What's my role in this? What's my purpose? Why am I here, and how can I serve God with the gifts that God gave me? And that's really what we've been trying to teach. How do I build my relationship with God, and elevate knowledge in the process?
Inshallah, that's beautiful. So the takeaway from that is to really focus on the books and the source, is what you're saying, because a lot of the time Muslims themselves, while well-meaning, may not have the knowledge or may not be able to cite the source for whatever belief they have.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, not everyone, this is a difficult time, right? We live in the age of the internet. People want fast answers. They've stopped reading books. So it's a hard thing, especially if you have, especially if you have children, if you tell them to go read a book, they're going to just look at you and laugh and, continue on with whatever they're doing, So it's, and there are many sources of knowledge. I guess the point is, to develop a discerning attitude, a critical, an attitude of critical thinking, an attitude of questioning. These are a lot of the things that are really, I think, suppressed for a lot of different reasons. I mean, you can get into the history, the politics, the power dynamics of why things are the way they are. But, aside, just to keep things simple, right? It's important as a human being to be engaged with your world and to be engaged with knowledge and to always be exploring and open, right? So knowledge comes from all different ways. It could be experiential, it could be, through your relationships with people, but books certainly, and certain, you just have to be discerning about where you get your knowledge, right? I mean, I think now it's like on the internet, the vast majority of things about Islam are wrong, or misleading, Islamophobic, and very intentionally so, because, there are a lot of people that have a lot of vested interest, financial and otherwise, in seeing that Islam is not portrayed in its intended beautiful way. But if you understand in your heart that Islam is a message from, our divine, maker, our creator, who wants for human beings to be elevated and beautiful and at the forefront of everything good, that has to drive you as a human being. And it's an active engagement. It's not a passive engagement. So, we should always be committed to searching for knowledge, searching for what is better, what is more elevated, from a human perspective. And so I think, so knowledge from all forms, but most importantly too is that relationship with God.
Mashallah, beautiful advice. Always be sure of your sources. And in that vein, just quickly, can we introduce our listeners to who exactly your husband is and what his credentials are?
Sure, absolutely. So his name is Khalid Abu Al-Fadl. He's a law professor at UCLA School of Law, and where he's been teaching for well over 20 years. But he's also a classically trained Islamic jurist. So he grew up in Egypt and Kuwait, studied under numerous sheikhs. His specialty is Islamic jurisprudence. So he's unique in the sense that he is an expert in both American law and Islamic law, and has, been here in the States for, over 30, oh my gosh, almost 40 years, I guess now. And so when we met, he was getting his PhD at Princeton, and, has pretty much dedicated his life, to scholarship, human rights, elevating Islamic law and Sharia. So he's one of, the world-renowned experts on Islamic law and Sharia. But he's well known for his work, in human rights, women's rights, animal rights. Pretty much has dedicated his life to studying the Qur'an, the Sirah, and really is known for a conviction about Islam being beautiful, like it's that beauty, not aesthetic beauty, but moral beauty, is one of the key values of Islam. And so that really informs all of his writing and all of his teaching. And I was very blessed that, a year after I became Muslim, that we met, and I was introduced to him through his scholarship. He was giving a lecture on women jurists in Islamic history, which really blew my mind. And I thought, okay, I need to find this person because I really want to learn from him. I thought his methodology was really just incredible. And I was so blessed that when I met him, I started on this journey of understanding Islam in a way that I think a lot of Muslims don't get exposed to. It's kind of like if you were Jewish and you married, a rabbi, or, maybe you married a Christian scholar, you get to see the depth and the beauty, and the commitment of knowledge that a scholar really delves into, and commits to. And so I learned early on, it was, for me personally, it was extremely valuable because, the world is crazy. You see Muslims and Islam blamed for a lot of really insane things, and you're trying to make sense of that. And so when I was able to turn to my husband and say, okay, can you please explain this to me? Like, why in the world, Muslims are supposed to be peaceful, so why are they at war and, chopping off heads and bombing things and suicide why is that? And I could have an answer for every little thing that I had a question about. God bless my husband. He was very patient with me. But I learned so much, not just in terms of like explanations of things, but methodology, right? Methodology is powerful because it's a tool for understanding your world. So if you come to the conviction that God is beautiful, God wants what is beautiful, and we know, like from the Quran, God is beautiful, God loves beauty. What does that really mean when it comes to your day-to-day life and how you view the world and the lens of understanding, okay, is this Islamic or is this not Islamic? Someone calls it Islamic, but that doesn't mean it is Islamic, and right. And to just get into that next level of nuance and sophistication and the ability to use your intellect, right? And you can reason through, does this make sense? Does this sit right with my heart? Does this sit right with my soul? Is this something that God would actually want if God is really committed to a beautiful, compassionate, merciful world? And you gain confidence in that, and that strengthens your faith. And I think that's what's oftentimes missing in our world, why a lot of times, people question Islam and stuff. They don't have that confidence and conviction because there's so much out there to shake your faith. And that's why I think knowledge gives you that, scholarship gives you that, an appreciation for truth gives you that strength. And so I've been so blessed that, through understanding kind of the methodology that my husband teaches, that became something that was instrumental to how I lived my life. And that's how we came to the Usuli Institute. Is like we teach, a methodology of, reason, rationality, beauty, humanism, human rights, everything that emanates from the values of the Quran. And, how do you take these moral principles and ethics that the Quran teaches, and how do you make it make sense for the world we live in today? Because, morality and like what was considered merciful and compassionate 1400 years ago is not necessarily what's going to be considered merciful and compassionate today. You know, we live in a different time,
Right.
different context. We have different challenges, things that, you know, didn't exist in the world back then, 1400 years ago. You know, we have the internet, we have video games, we have cell phones, you know, I mean, you know, we have cars. And so we have to know what is the methodology for applying an ethical framework to our lives. And that's, I think, what is, you know, really powerful about, about my husband's scholarship and about, you know, a life dedicated to teaching this methodology.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So how did the name come about, Usuli Institute? Was it both of you who came up with it, or and what does it mean for our listeners who might not have the
So,
knowledge?
I mean, usuli, you know, as an Arabic word, I believe it means like, you know, foundations or fundamentals. But usuli is a school of thought. It's a methodology, and it's the, you know. So my husband is an usuli, and there, you know, are many famous scholars throughout history who are usulis. And I, you know, if you do a Google search, you'll find, oh, you know, Usuli was some, you know, Shi'i school. That's actually not. I mean, that may be true, but that's, I mean, it is true, but it's not what the usage is that we're using. So Usuli is the sort of the moniker, I guess, for this approach and methodology that uses reason, rational thought, and is, you know, and maybe another way of understanding it is let's contrast it to some other schools of thought, right? So there are more conservative schools of thought. You know, if you're familiar with like the Wahhabi school of thought or al-Hadith, more literalist views. So, in a, you know, to give you an example, if you're approaching the Quran, if you're a literalist, then you would read, you know, the text, and maybe it would tell you, you know, in this particular situation, you have to do X, Y, or Z. So, you know, it's like, you know, well, laws of inheritance get a little bit complicated, but you can imagine with certain things you would take a literal reading and you would have to believe that you would apply that literal reading. With an Usuli approach, it would be more like you would be open to understanding, like it's not just a literal reading, like maybe God talks about, you know, there are certain things in the Quran that are very clear, and there are certain things that are less clear. And so you might say, and this is one of the things we've talked about, and actually it's one of the classes we've been teaching recently. So in the situation where it's less clear, why is it less clear? Is it because you have to take into account context, you know, like the time that you're living in, the culture you're living in, you know, the ramifications on, you know, human rights, animal rights, environmental rights. You know, so an Usuli would take the principle and expand and think through, you know, like a richer understanding. What is it that God is trying to tell us to do, and come up with, you know, not necessarily literal application, but a more, I think, inclusive application, more rational, reasonable, based on more factors. So it is, you know, and so now today we understand that, okay, there are, you know, 4 Sunni schools of thought, you know, Hanbali, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, but at one time there were hundreds of schools of thought. And, you know, this is like when Islam was at its height. And these were schools that came at the Quran and came at interpretation in very different ways. And they were equally orthodox because you had people that were engaging and doing due diligence. You know, maybe this is a little bit too complex, but the idea that, you know, we came from a time where there used to be a lot of very vibrant intellectual discussion about every single point. It's like, you know, when you look at the Jewish tradition, you say, you know, you joke that, okay, you have 10 rabbis in a room, you have a question, you have 15 different answers. Well, that actually, you know, that's what it was like for Islamic scholars at one point. And there were so many schools of thought and so many different, it was just this rich, vibrant discussion. And it was something beautiful, you know. And we, unfortunately, have lost a lot of that in the modern age. But so to return to your original question, so the Usuli, you know, it was really my husband's school of thought, and it was, you know, our official name is the Institute for Advanced Usuli Studies. So we try to teach, you know, something deeper than the superficial, and we get into, you know, critical thinking, really trying to delve into the tradition, you know. So we start from the fundamentals. It's not like a, you know, reinterpretation. It's building on our whole history, our whole intellectual history. But again, it's like taking those moral principles that are timeless and trying to apply them to our modern age, so that Islam becomes a very vibrant part of your life. You know, so it's relevant. It's not like, you know, we have to return.
Comes alive.
Yeah, it comes alive, and it makes you
becomes universal.
Right.
Becomes conceptual.
Right.
Yes.
And so, you know, we're told that Islam is a message for humanity, not just for Muslims.
Right.
So, you know, if someone's asking you, well, okay, you know, how should we feel about the death penalty? How should we feel about, you know, people getting trafficked? How should we feel about, you know, pornography on the internet? Well, these are things that we should engage with, you know, Islamic principles for the betterment of the entire of humanity, not just Muslims. So,
right, because as you pointed out, the Quran is the last, the complete, the universal message. So
right.
we have problems today that obviously were not addressed 1400 years ago.
Right, right. You know, and
it does not make sense to literally interpret something.
Right.
It's just impossible.
Exactly. And it's a message of justice. You know, it's about elevation, justice, and mercy. And so, you know, through and through, it's like we have to think always in terms of what is the most just and, you know, or virtuous and beautiful path, and we need to be at the forefront of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I remember having a similar time on my journey where you run into those issues, and then if you've been reading your Quran and really engaging, you keep remembering that at the beginning, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, and you think mercy and compassion, and it almost becomes like a mantra.
Absolutely.
You know, and then when you start framing the issues with this in your mind, well, then a lot of the hard line, the strict, the black and white doesn't make any sense to you anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's a real convert issue, because as converts coming, you know, from all different backgrounds, and as human beings, we want something to be black and white. It's just the way we're built. We want it to be clear, and we want to be right. You know, we want to be doing the right thing. We want to be following the right path. And I think it's very important for converts to realize that, and it's a beautiful way to sum it up, that while this path to Islam is straight, it's very wide and very diverse. And, you know, historically, we didn't have the judgment that we have today, like where one Islamic scholar will slander another Islamic scholar for a difference of opinion. Like, it wasn't there. It shouldn't be there. We were given reason, and we were made different, and we're told all of this in the Quran as well, for a reason. So
right, absolutely.
I think that approach, that methodology, is absolutely needed today.
Well, you know, human beings are not black and white. You know, I mean, they're shades of gray, right? And so why should your religion be black and white? Your religion should be expansive enough to accommodate all of the shades of humanity. And so, and, you know, the road is not just wide, but it's also bumpy. You know, it's not going to be easy. But, you know, one of the most beautiful things that I always remember my husband was saying to someone is, you know, like, justice is one thing. Like, you know, if you think about on the final day, do you want God to treat you with justice? Because justice is like fair, right? It's like you're absolutely treated, you get what you deserve. But maybe that's not exactly what you want, because if you get what you deserve, you might not get exactly, you know, what you want, right? You want God to be merciful. You want God to be compassionate, which is much more than justice. And,
you want God to understand.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, you know, and we know from the Quran time and time again, you know, God is like, you know, God is the most merciful and compassionate and gives you much more and much better than you deserve, which we get every single day. So.
Absolutely. Well, that's mashallah. So now you have the background for the wonderful workers doing this wonderful work at the Usuli Institute and what they're about. If you want to talk a little bit about your newest project, Grace, which you did mention it, I think, and how this can really help a new generation of Muslim scholars to reframe how we talk about controversial issues, especially modern controversial issues.
Yeah, so what's really interesting, so the project that we're working on right now is, it's called Project Illumine, the Light of the Quran. And it's an intensive, immersive project where we actually have, a number of research fellows gathered here in Ohio, and we've been focusing on the Quran. So in truth, my husband, Professor Abul, has been sharing his lifelong journey with the Quran, and it's literally a lifelong engagement. That he actually was not intending to share, but it just from the various, you plan and Allah plans is what we always are told. But so he is sharing. He was obsessed with the Quran from the time he was really young. Like, why was the Quran organized the way it was? Why was, what was it like when it was revealed to the Prophet? What was the message that the early Muslims received? How did they receive it? Why were certain chapters named the way that they were, and just like a scholar's mind, like really goes down the rabbit hole. But so this really guided an entire lifetime engagement, and a lot of reading every single commentary he could get his hands on, but spending a lot of time in prayer, a lot of time in reflection. And the thing that he arrived at, which is actually something that has not really been arrived at in the tradition previously, is that every single chapter has a unique moral message. So, there are 114 chapters in the Quran. So each chapter has its own unique moral message. And as 114 parts of a whole, the Quran as a whole also has a moral message. And he, thought to himself, this was just his own personal engagement. Again, he wasn't planning to ever share it with anybody. And he just assumed, well, everyone must know this. So we would be at home, and he would be doing something, and he'd come and he would say to me, "Did you know that in the Quran, in this chapter, that blah blah blah?" And he'd share some gold nugget, and I would just flip out. And I'm like, "Are you kidding? Nobody knows this. I have never heard anything like this. You have to share this." And this was, we had started the Usuli Institute, and we were doing, classes or halaqas, like once a month, and so we would talk about different Islamic issues. But so, he would do this enough times where he started thinking, oh my gosh, well, maybe I should talk about some of the stuff that, that I've kind of arrived at. And so he's like, okay, well, maybe let's do a halakha, and I'll share. And he had never, he'd always been very shy and reticent to share his own, personal engagement. It's more like, it's easier as a scholar to try and just share what other scholars have said, and maybe just kind of fudge a little bit what you think. But, you don't want to take it, you don't take credit for something that's original. It's easier just to, throw it in with everything else you're saying. And that's what he would do. He would, we used to do some halakas on different chapters of the Quran, and he would go line by line and say, well, some scholars say this, some scholars say that. So this approach was very different. It was much more thematic. We weren't going to go line by line necessarily, but he would talk about, an overall theme. So, for example, our very first halakha, which was kind of our pilot episode, was on Surah Hadid, Al-Hadid, which it means iron. And from an incredible halakha, the main moral message takeaway is God wants you to be strong like iron, not strong like a rock. Because if you're strong like iron, under pressure, under heat, under the test of life, you need to become flexible and bend like iron. But rocks under pressure can often crumble, right? So God wants us to be strong like iron, not strong like a rock. I mean, there was a lot more to it, but that was kind of the main moral message from that, which was mind-blowing. And there's so much to go with that. And so people, and this is online, you can actually find this halakha. And so from that, people had an incredible reaction. So he was really surprised. And he said, okay, maybe I'll do another one. And so he did Surah Al-Jathiyah. And it was, this idea, how your hands and your body parts will testify against you on the final day, right? And so we always have these crazy ideas oh, my hand is going to start talking. My ears are going to start talking, right? My leg is going to start talking. But through his analysis and, these are lengthy halakas, so we would sit 4, 5, 6 hours and jump into these surahs. But one of the main takeaways is, these revelations came to the early Muslims at a time when there was no such thing as like video, right? Recordings. Um, but the idea that, on the final day, you will see, like, effectively like a recording of everything you've done in your life, like sins you've committed, and that is the way. But you'll see it in its true form. Like, we live life, and we kind of, maybe we'll sin, and we'll tell ourselves, oh, that wasn't that bad, and we justify things, right? But we know that when on the final day, you'll see the truth of what your actions produced, whether if you hurt people, or you were kind, or whatever. And so Jathia would basically point it out. You will see the deeds, before you, like a recording, like a video, like what we understand today. And they will play, they will play before you, and that's how your body parts are going to testify, because you'll see your body, you'll see what you said, you'll see, where you went with your feet, and all of that kind of thing. And he backs this up. It's not just like, oh, this is my idea. He backs it up with like this wealth of knowledge and evidence, and like commentaries, and just digs out of our tradition. Yeah, everything. And it's fascinating because he was really, just obsessed with the idea of, okay, these Muslims received a message at their time that they understood so clearly what was being said to them. But we don't understand that, right? Like, if we think in terms of what's commonplace to us today, if 100 years from now people are like trying to understand our writings about the internet, maybe there's going to be some technology that's 1,000 times better. They'll be like, what's an internet? Like, what's a cell phone, right? But so it's going to be.
We have that today with like, what's a compact disc?
Exactly, right. So it's going to be up to the scholars to go back and dig the history and do the research and find out. Even if you use an expression like, oh my God, that blew my mind, right? So someone could be like, what were they like, blowing their minds? Were they like killing themselves? But no, it like, so you have to understand like a context, and and a culture and a language and idioms, and like the whole thing. You have to go back and read Arabic poetry. What were they talking about in poetry? How were the people talking about their enemies, and what were and how did they speak to one another? Because poetry was like a huge way that people, that was like the equivalent of our media, right? The poets back then were like our media influencers today. So basically, he spent his entire life like digging into this for every single surah, and came to the understanding of, okay, I've read everything I could get my hands on. And then beyond that, he also believes that the Quran will not open up to you unless you do your requisite. You have a relationship with God, that you pray and you ask.
And if you're not open yourself,
right?
When you're not reading it, if you're
not clean,
if you have a predetermined end goal, then that's where you're going.
Right.
You have to read it as an open, as a dial. It's a living, breathing text.
Right.
Yes,
and absolutely. I think the more you invest in it, the more it'll give back. So if you're spending hours in night in dhikr, and and reflection and prayer, it's like all of that. You have to be a clean soul, and God is not just going to reveal the secrets of the Quran to you without you being worthy, right? So
absolutely.
I mean that. So what we're receiving now through this is the fruit of all of that labor, like a scholar's labor over an entire lifetime. And so when you hear like what he presents, your mind is blown, because like when you hear truth, it touches you in a part of your soul that it's visceral. Like when you hear stupid stuff, it's stupid stuff. You hear someone making something up, it. It's like, okay, that's BS, and I know that's BS.
Insincere.
Yeah,
the insincerity of it. Yeah.
But when you hear something and it touches you deeply, and it and so your heart and your mind are like, okay, this now we're talking. Okay, now this makes sense. That, and that is when the Quran comes alive, and you go, oh my God, this is what God actually wanted for us. And what has been mind-blowing is when God talks about, like, even just things like power dynamics, wealth, right? We see in our own world how much wealth is like held in the hands of such a small percentage of the population, and how much injustice and inequity and oppression, and like these are the themes, these are the things that God is talking about and warning us against and telling us how to fight against these things. They're relevant for us in our time, more so I think in many ways, because we have certain power dynamics that didn't exist. We have more like global connection, and it feels like we're more interconnected to our world. So if something happens, in China, you've got, the coronavirus, and pretty soon the entire world is affected, right, through global travel and all of that. So that, that didn't happen 1400 years ago. This has been an incredible journey, in understanding, like we've been just doing deep dives in every single surah, and now we're on our 74th surah. So we came to start this project a year ago. We were doing 2 halakas a week, each halakah 4, 5, 6 hours long, clicking through, and just literally sitting there and receiving the fruit of this labor. We spent 14 days on Surah Baqarah. We spent, I think, about 5 or 6 days on Imran. Right now we're on Surah Nisa. So these are some of the really long surahs. We've now finished all of the Meccan surahs. And the thing that has been transformative, okay, so I'm almost going to be 28 years a Muslim on March 1st. That's my anniversary. And alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. And before we started this project, I've read the Quran through. I, would turn to the Quran, but the Quran is not, like, if you're really honest, no one really cares about the Quran. Like, people, like in mainstream Muslims, it's like people refer to it, but it's not the center of their existence, because a lot of times they don't understand it. They don't, people are more focused on hadith than they are on the Quran.
Yes.
Right?
And that is hugely problematic. And we could probably just pause for a second, because for somebody who is just, exploring Islam, or maybe newly converted, so the hadith are just the sayings in teachings, quote unquote, of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And this is obviously problematic for many reasons. But the Quran, as we take it, are the actual literal words of God. Nobody disputes or discusses what is in there in terms of, is it authentic? We take it as authentic. But the hadith, on the other hand, and Grace, you can probably speak to this, are a little bit more complicated to sift through and to also apply, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that I've learned, hadith is a very nuanced technical science that really is not for lay people. You need to be a scholar of hadith.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
But you wouldn't know that the way Muslims deal with hadith. So it's kind of like saying, okay, so...
On memes and flippantly, you mean?
Yeah, and, hadith, okay, so the hadith, for an example, is, we get a lot from the hadith. Like, we learn how to pray, we learn, a lot of different things. But you also hear things like, okay, the hadith say you're not allowed to have dogs, or the hadith say that you can't pray in your house, whatever. Or that there's a hadith that the Prophet tried to commit suicide. Okay, which is so blasphemous. But, if you understand some of the history, like hadith were created, by people. It's like someone saying, oh, I heard the Prophet say this, or I heard so-and-so say that he heard so-and-so say he heard so-and-so. Hear the Prophet say something or do something, right? So it's kind of like a report from human being to human being and passed down. But a lot of these hadith were also invented and created for political reasons, because there, at the time of the Prophet, there were a lot of people who were anti-Islam, and it's hard now, 1400 years later, unless you are specialized and trained, to be able to sift through and understand, like, okay, what is actually authentic. And it's not a black and white thing, right? There are degrees of authenticity too. So it's like, okay, this is very likely versus not very likely, and everything in between. But the way Muslims these days treat hadith is they have no sense of what is actually, that nuance or anything. But they spend a lot of time talking about the hadith. And to me, after this project, I don't understand why we're not spending all that time focused on the Quran and understanding the Quran, because that's the message that is worth delving into and truly understanding, because it's so rich and so deep. And the thing that I think that is also really struck me is, I'm not an Arabic speaker, and so I have to rely on English translations. And English translations have become so like so minimal. Like after you spend all this time studying a surah and you pick apart even one verse and you understand the depth of meaning that one verse can have, you almost get angry that English translations are so paltry. It's like, what?
Mm-hmm.
This is one line translation, but there were 10 different ways you could understand this. And if you understand the history and the context and all of that, you feel cheated. And so, because there's just a world more meaning. And so then you start thinking, okay, why are we not learning this? Why is no one teaching this? Because it just, when you feel like the world starts making sense to you and you start understanding that everything fits together and that God actually had a very sophisticated, deep message, like, why are we not learning this? And why is this not our world? And it's not. It just isn't. And that's what's really sad.
To interject one thing right here, if you are an English speaker and solely an English speaker, a great resource, in my opinion, is Qur'an.com, because it does have also the historical context and traditional tafsirs and all that kind of stuff attached to, like, I don't know, it's like an insane amount of translations that you can get,
Right.
so that you can really look over, okay, they use this word for this Arabic word and this guy used this word. So it kind of, I mean, obviously it's not going to be perfect, but
it's different,
it kind of
because
gives you a better,
I mean, it's when you do line by line, you're gonna be limited, because you can have differences of opinions about words. So what's different about what we're doing is, again, it's a thematic approach. It takes into consideration the history, the context, sort of the full picture of what was happening at the time that this message was revealed. So you understand, like, okay, Surah Baqarah came, after Muslims had, migrated to a new state. They were, after this particular battle, like this surah came after they were defeated. This surah came after, they won. I mean, so when you understand, like, kind of what was happening, and what was the Quran reacting to, and it just gives you a lot richer understanding of the message. And so while it's important, and what we're talking about here is kind of like, this is a lot, right? I mean, honestly, like when you're thinking about converting, okay, like when I think back
converting,
sorry, and I have to apologize, but like 28 years ago, when I was thinking of converting, my biggest, worry was like, what is my family going to think? They're going to think I've fallen off the deep end, and how am I going to tell my parents? And, and how can I even consider myself a Muslim, because everyone in the world thinks Muslims are crazy, so they're just going to think I'm one of those. So these are big questions. What we're talking about now is hopefully, something to seed you, if you decide to convert, or if you've newly converted, there's a new game, a new challenge, right? You have to climb a mountain just to become a Muslim. But once you become a Muslim, you've got to climb another couple of mountains to stay Muslim, stay engaged, fight, like all of the stuff that's coming at you that's negative. And you have to find, what is my lifeline to sanity? And that's knowledge, and that is like, that's the Quran. So this is something that, when you get your bearings, because it's a huge change to adopt a new religion and convert and decide, okay, I'm going to change everything about, what I'm doing. But when you're further in and things start not making sense to you, and you want to understand, okay, what is the point of all of this, and how do I increase my understanding, increase my relationship with God, and really expand my, my level of confidence and my understanding of things. It's the Quran. The Quran has to be that center point, and it has to take a different place on stage in your life, in the life of our community, in the life of the world. And it starts by understanding. And the Quran is really hard to understand, deeply. Without the help of scholars, and then you have to find the right scholars, because there are certain scholars that are going to tell you something that might not sit well with your heart or your mind. So not to overwhelm people, but just to say, what, it's there for you. There's so much, and it's the key to to sanity and strength and confidence and beauty, is this knowledge and this approach. And so I hope that more people, you know, when they're ready, I mean, you know, and interested in digging deep and, you know, investing time and energy, that's what we're doing. And we have everything that we do, you know, up on the internet, you know, and on YouTube for free. So all of this is accessible. It just requires patience and willingness.